Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Economics channel. Tonight, we're going to follow a single thread of white crystal, a thread that runs, almost invisibly, through the entire fabric of human civilization, the way a quiet underground river runs beneath a city its people barely think about. That thread is salt. It doesn't look like much. A handful of small, colorless grains, easy to overlook on a table, easy to underestimate entirely. But for most of human history, salt was one of the most valuable substances on Earth, fought over, taxed, smuggled, worshipped, and occasionally powerful enough to bring down governments. Entire cities were built because of it. Entire trade networks stretched across deserts and mountains because of it. Wars were financed by it. Empires were bankrolled by it. And one very ordinary English word, the word salary, still carries its name inside it, quietly, every time we use it. Tonight we'll wander slowly through that history, through ancient salt roads and Roman soldiers, through ochre desert caravans and gray alpine mines, through Chinese monopolies, French revolts, and a barefoot walk to the sea in 1930 that helped end an empire. If any of this settles into your evening the way a warm cup settles into cold hands, consider leaving a like or subscribing on your way towards sleep. It helps this channel keep telling these long, slow stories, and there's no pressure at all about it tonight. For now, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw loosen. Let your breathing slow down, one unhurried breath at a time, in and out, without any effort behind it. You don't need to remember any of this. You only need to listen and let it carry you. Let's begin. Long before coins, before markets, before writing itself, the human body already understood the value of salt. Every mammal needs sodium to keep its nerves firing and its muscles working, and early humans, like the animals around them, were drawn instinctively towards salt licks and briny springs. Archaeologists have found evidence that some of the very first organized human activity, beyond hunting and gathering, centered on these salty places. Groups gathered at the same mineral springs generation after generation, wearing paths into the earth that would later become some of the oldest trade routes on the planet. This is where our story quietly begins, not in a palace or a market, but at a muddy spring where thirsty animals and hungry humans crossed paths. More than 8,000 years ago, in what is now northern China, people were already boiling salty water in clay pots to make it evaporate. Imagine a small settlement near Lake Yuncheng, low fires burning through the night, shallow pans of brine slowly thickening into crystal. This wasn't a hobby. It was one of the earliest known forms of organized food processing on Earth, older than most of the technologies we associate with early civilization. The salt they made didn't just season food, it preserved it, turning a good hunt or a good harvest into something that could survive the lean months of winter. In that quiet transformation, from perishable to lasting, lies something close to the origin of the idea of stored wealth itself. The oldest known walled town in Europe wasn't built for a king, or a temple, or a river crossing. It was built to guard salt. At Provadia Solnitsata, in what is now Bulgaria, archaeologists uncovered a settlement more than 6,000 years old, its residents boiling brine from a nearby spring in ovens and pouring it into molds to harden. The town had stone walls 2 meters thick, an extraordinary investment of labor for a Neolithic community. Nobody builds a wall like that to protect vegetables. They build it because what's inside is worth stealing. and because someone, somewhere, already understood that whoever controls the salt controls something no neighboring village can easily do without. Salt's power came from something deceptively simple. It slows down decay. Rubbed into meat or fish, it drew out moisture that bacteria needed to survive, turning food that would spoil in days into food that could last through an entire season. This one property reshaped how early societies planned their lives, how far they could travel, how long they could store surplus, how many people a community could feed through a bad winter. A fishing village on a cold coastline, a herding community on a dry plain, a river town gathering its harvest, all of them independently arrived at the same discovery, that a pinch of white crystal could quietly stretch a season of food into a full year of survival. Imagine a coastal settlement on the Atlantic edge of Europe 4,000 years ago, where families spread seawater across shallow clay pans and waited for the sun to do the rest. This slow, patient method, solar evaporation, required almost no fuel and almost no tools, only flat land, salt water, and time. It became one of humanity's first renewable industries, repeated in one form or another from Portugal to India to the Caribbean. There is something quietly moving about a technology that hasn't really changed in 4,000 years, because the sun and the sea were never in need of an upgrade. Inland communities, far from any coastline, faced a harder problem and solved it in their own way. In Central Europe, near what is now Hallstatt in the Austrian Alps, people began tunneling directly into a mountain that held veins of solid rock salt more than 7,000 years old. By around 800 BCE, Hallstatt had become a genuine mining settlement, its miners descending into torchlit shafts with bronze picks, hauling out a mineral so valuable that the entire era of European prehistory that followed, the Hallstatt culture, takes its name from this one salt-rich valley. A whole chapter of the human timeline named after a mountain of salt. The Hallstatt miners left behind something unexpected, their own bodies, remarkably preserved by the very substance they extracted. Salt's dehydrating power, so useful for meat and fish, worked just as well on human tissue, and several ancient miners who died underground were found millennia later with skin, hair, and even the contents of their stomachs still intact. From those preserved remains, researchers learned what these people actually ate: grains, beans, fatty meat, a small, strange gift passed forward through thousands of years by accident. There is something quietly poignant in that. The substance a person spent their life mining became, without any plan at all, the thing that let them speak to us across 7,000 years of silence. Salt didn't just preserve food and bodies. In many early societies, it carried spiritual weight as well. Ancient Egyptians used salt-based natron in the process of mummification, drying the body before the long journey they believed awaited it. In parts of West Africa and the Sahara, salt slabs were treated almost as sacred objects, wrapped, guarded, and exchanged with a formality usually reserved for gold. Long before anyone wrote a treatise on economics, human beings had already decided, independently, in dozens of unconnected cultures, that this ordinary mineral deserved to sit close to the boundary between the practical and the holy. Here is something easy to miss. Salt is one of the very few essential human resources that isn't concentrated in just one place, and isn't produced everywhere either. Some regions had abundant salt springs, salt lakes, or seaside flats. others had none within hundreds of miles. This uneven distribution, one valley rich in salt, the next valley with none at all, created something economics would later have a name for: comparative advantage, and with it, an ancient and permanent incentive to trade. Long before markets or money existed in any formal sense, geography itself had already written the first rules of commerce into the landscape. This is what makes salt's early history so quietly remarkable. It wasn't imposed by any king or invented by any merchant class. It emerged, over and over, in isolated pockets of humanity who had never met each other, arriving at the same conclusion through the same basic need. Chinese lake boilers, Bulgarian wall builders, Alpine tunnelers, Atlantic pan evaporators, none of them coordinated with one another, and yet they all built their earliest economies around the same humble crystal. Sometimes, the deepest patterns in human history aren't handed down. They're rediscovered, quietly, again and again, by people separated by oceans and centuries who never knew they had anything in common. No civilization tied its identity to salt quite as tightly as Rome did, and the proof is hiding in plain sight, inside a word we use every single day. The Latin word for salt was sal, and from it came salarium, a term originally connected to payments made to Roman soldiers, at least partly associated with the money used to buy salt. Centuries later, that Latin root traveled through French and into English and became our modern word, salary. Every time someone mentions their salary, they are, without realizing it, echoing a Roman soldier's ration of a mineral that once helped decide whether an army could function at all. Historians still debate the exact mechanics of the Roman salarium, whether soldiers were literally paid in salt or paid in coins specifically earmarked for salt, or simply paid an allowance loosely associated with its cost. The precise details have blurred over 2,000 years, the way any old family story loses its sharp edges with each retelling. But the underlying truth survived intact. Salt was valuable enough and essential enough that Rome built its language of compensation around it. It's a small, quiet reminder that economic vocabulary is rarely invented from nothing. It grows out of whatever people once needed most. Rome's hunger for salt shaped its infrastructure directly. One of the empire's oldest roads, the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road, stretched from the Adriatic coast inland toward Rome, carrying salt harvested from coastal pans up into the heart of the growing city. Imagine ox-drawn carts creaking along that dusty route, laborers walking beside them for days, moving a resource so ordinary-looking and so quietly indispensable that the road itself needed a name devoted entirely to it. Long before Rome built roads for conquest, it built one for salt, and that choice says something about what a civilization decides matters first. As Rome expanded, it recognized what nearly every large state eventually recognizes: that a resource everyone needs is also a resource everyone can be taxed on. Roman authorities placed levies on salt production and trade at various points in the empire's long history, and salt monopolies appeared in some provinces, tightly controlled by the state. It's a pattern that would repeat, almost without exception, in nearly every major civilization that followed: China, France, Britain, India, each one eventually arriving at the same realization that a substance nobody can live without is also a substance nobody can easily refuse to pay for. Roman soldiers, meanwhile, depended on salt for something even more immediate than payment: survival on campaign. Salted meat and fish traveled far better than fresh food, and a legion marching through unfamiliar territory needed provisions that could last for weeks without spoiling. In a very real sense, salt was part of what made long-distance Roman military logistics possible at all, extending the range of an army the way, centuries later, canned food would extend the range of ships. This is what makes it so quietly remarkable. An empire's capacity to project power across a continent rested, in part, on something as unglamorous as keeping meat from rotting. The word salad shares the same root as salary and salt. It comes from the old practice of salting fresh greens, a small culinary habit from the Roman world that survived, transformed almost beyond recognition into a completely different dish. Language, like sediment, holds on to traces of things long after their original purpose has dissolved. Somewhere underneath a modern salad bowl and a modern paycheck, the same ancient mineral is quietly present, unnoticed, in the words themselves. In the medieval Sahara, one of history's strangest and most elegant trading systems developed between people who, by some accounts, never even saw each other's faces. Salt merchants from the north would arrive at a fixed spot in the desert, lay down their slabs of salt, and withdraw a distance away. Gold traders would then approach, leave what they judged to be a fair quantity of gold beside the salt, and retreat in turn. The salt merchants would return, and if satisfied, take the gold and leave. If not, they'd withdraw again, leaving the gold untouched, until both sides silently agreed on a price. Historians call it silent trade, and it is one of the earliest recorded examples of a functioning market built entirely on trust, without a single word exchanged. Imagine the Saharan trade routes at their height. Sometime around the 12th or 13th century, camel caravans stretching for miles, laden with slabs of rock salt cut from mines deep in the desert interior, moving south toward the wealthy trading cities near the Niger River. Some of these slabs of salt were worth their weight in gold, quite literally, once they reached their destination, because in the salt-poor regions of West Africa, this white mineral was as scarce and as prized as the precious metal it was traded for. Two resources, each abundant on one side of a desert and rare on the other, quietly balanced each other across 1,000 miles of sand. The city of Timbuktu grew wealthy in large part by sitting at the crossroads of this salt and gold economy, a meeting point where northern caravans and southern traders exchanged goods, knowledge, and eventually scholarship. Its famous libraries and universities, renowned across the medieval Islamic world, were funded in no small part by a trade built on a mineral most people today wouldn't think twice about sprinkling onto dinner. Wealth built on salt eventually built something far less perishable: centuries of accumulated books, manuscripts, and ideas, some of which survive to this day. The Tagaza salt mines, deep in the Sahara, produced enormous slabs of pure rock salt that were cut directly out of the desert floor and loaded onto camels for the long journey south. Miners lived and worked in an extraordinarily harsh environment, far from any oasis, entirely dependent on food and water brought in by the same caravans that would later carry their salt away. It's a strange, almost inverted arrangement. A settlement built around an abundance of exactly the one thing its own residents couldn't eat or drink, surrounded by a landscape that offered nothing else at all. A caravan crossing the Sahara might include over 1,000 camels. walking for weeks between wells, guided by experienced desert navigators who could read the shifting dunes the way a sailor reads open water. The risks were severe: sandstorms, dwindling water, raiders, disorientation in an ocean of identical horizon. And yet caravan after caravan made the crossing for centuries, because on the far side of that risk waited a trade lucrative enough to justify it. Again and again, generation after generation. This is what makes the Saharan salt trade so hauntingly elegant. It connected two civilizations who rarely met in person, through an exchange built almost entirely on mutual need and quiet trust. No shared language was required, no shared currency, no shared government, no shared religion in many cases. Only a mineral that one side had too much of, and the other side had none of at all, and the patient, repeated willingness of both to meet somewhere in between. China holds the distinction of running what may be the oldest continuously enforced government monopoly in human history, and its subject was salt. As early as the 7th century BCE, the state of Qi began taxing salt production, recognizing that a resource every single subject needed, regardless of wealth or region, was an almost perfect tax base. By the time the Han dynasty formalized a full state monopoly around 119 BCE, salt revenue had become one of the central pillars of imperial finance, sometimes accounting for a remarkably large share of total government income. A government could tax land, and landowners could resist. It could tax trade, and merchants could evade. But it was very difficult for anyone to simply stop needing salt. Imagine an official Chinese salt bureau sometime during the Tang dynasty, ledgers stacked high, clerks recording every jin of salt moving through licensed channels. The state didn't merely tax salt. In many periods, it controlled its production and distribution directly, issuing certificates to licensed merchants who alone were permitted to buy, transport, and sell it. This certificate system, called the Yanyin, is sometimes cited by historians as an early ancestor of modern negotiable financial instruments, since these salt certificates could themselves be traded, essentially functioning as a form of proto-currency backed by a guaranteed commodity. Illegal salt trading in imperial China wasn't a minor offense. It was treated, at various points, with the severity reserved for serious crimes against the state. Smugglers who bypassed the official monopoly risked harsh punishment, and yet the profits available to those willing to take the risk were large enough that illegal salt networks persisted for centuries, weaving through the empire alongside the legal trade like a shadow economy running parallel to the official one. Wherever a government builds a wall of law around a resource people cannot live without, a quiet channel tends to open up around it. Salt tax revenue helped fund some of Imperial China's most ambitious undertakings, sections of canal building, military campaigns, and the ordinary machinery of a vast bureaucracy governing an enormous population. During certain periods, salt taxes are estimated to have provided as much as half of total state revenue, an almost unimaginable dependence on a single mineral. It's a strange kind of foundation for an empire, not gold, not silver, not land, but something small enough to fit in a closed fist, and yet vital enough to fund the governance of tens of millions of people. The salt monopoly system in China rose and fell in strictness across different dynasties, tightened by rulers needing revenue, loosened by rulers wary of provoking unrest, and tightened again as fiscal pressure returned. This slow rhythm, tighten, loosen, tighten again, echoes through nearly every salt-taxing government in history, an old and familiar dance between a state's need for revenue and a population's tolerance for paying it. This is what makes it so quietly fascinating. The same basic tension over a mineral this ordinary repeats itself across cultures and centuries that otherwise share almost nothing in common. In medieval Northern Europe, an entire alliance of trading cities grew rich, partly on the strength of a single commodity moving between two seas. The Hanseatic League, a network of merchant towns stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea, built much of its early wealth on the herring trade. And herring, without salt, was worthless within days. The town of Lüneburg, sitting atop a rich underground salt deposit, became one of the wealthiest cities in the region, its brine pumped up and boiled down in furnaces that burned day and night to keep pace with demand. Salt from Lüneburg traveled north to Baltic fishing ports, preserved the herring catch, and from there fed much of medieval Europe through long winters. Imagine the port town of Lübeck at the height of Hanseatic trade, warehouses packed with barrels, some full of salt arriving from the south, others full of salted fish ready to depart. The connection between these two goods was so tight that historians sometimes describe Lüneburg's salt and the Baltic herring trade as two halves of a single economic engine, each one worthless to distant markets without the other. It's a quiet reminder that resources rarely create wealth alone. It's the relationship between resources, the salt that meets the fish, that turns raw material into lasting prosperity. Salzburg, whose very name translates roughly to Salt Fortress, built its wealth and its striking Baroque skyline on nearby alpine salt mines that had been worked in one form or another since Hallstatt times thousands of years earlier. The archbishops who ruled the city controlled salt production tightly, using its revenue to fund grand churches, palaces, and the cultural patronage that would, centuries later, help produce a musical prodigy named Mozart. It's an odd thread to trace, but a real one. Some of the most refined music in European history was, in a distant sense, financed by underground deposits of an ordinary mineral. Venice, meanwhile, built an entire commercial empire, partly on its control of salt pans in the lagoon and its dominance over Mediterranean salt shipping routes. The Venetian state carefully regulated salt production and trade, using the revenue and the strategic leverage it provided to help fund the city's broader maritime and mercantile ambitions across the eastern Mediterranean. Imagine flat-bottomed boats gliding between shallow salt pans at dawn, workers raking crystallized salt into gleaming white mounds, feeding a trade network that would eventually stretch as far as Constantinople and Alexandria. Across medieval Europe, salt roads crisscrossed the continent in a dense, quiet lattice, the Via Salaria's descendants, unofficial and official, carrying salt from coastal pans and mountain mines toward inland towns that had none of their own. Tolls were collected at bridges and gates along these routes, small payments extracted from merchants at every stage of the journey, so that by the time salt reached a distant village, its price might be many times what it had been at its source. This is what makes it so quietly telling. Long before modern supply chains, medieval Europe had already discovered how many hands and how many small fees could gather around something as simple as the movement of salt from one place to another. Few taxes in history are remembered with as much bitterness as the French Gabelle, a salt tax that endured, in various forms, for more than 5 centuries. First introduced in the 14th century and formalized further under later monarchs, the gabelle didn't just tax salt. In many regions, it required households to purchase a fixed minimum quantity every year, regardless of whether they needed it, at a price set entirely by the crown. Imagine a rural household in the French countryside, forced each year to buy salt it might not use, simply because the law demanded it, the way a modern household might resent a fee charged regardless of consumption. The gabelle wasn't applied evenly across France, and that unevenness became one of its most resented features. Some regions, called Pays de Grandes Gabelles, paid steep prices under strict enforcement. Others, through old exemptions and privileges, paid far less, or nothing at all. This meant that a bag of salt might cost many times more on one side of an internal border than the other, creating a booming, dangerous underground trade in smuggled salt, known as faux sonnage, carried out by smugglers called faux sauniers, who risked imprisonment, galley service, or worse if caught. These salt smugglers became, in a strange twist of popular memory, something close to folk figures, not universally admired, but not universally condemned either, operating in the gray space between criminal and quiet rebel. Entire smuggling networks developed methods for moving salt across regional borders under cover of darkness, hollowed carts, false floors, routes memorized across generations. It's a familiar pattern by now. Wherever a state draws a sharp legal line around something people need, an entire shadow economy tends to grow up along that line, thriving in its cracks. Resentment over the gabelle simmered for generations, a small but constant irritant layered on top of many other grievances against the French monarchy. By the time revolution swept through France in 1789, the salt tax had become one of the concrete, everyday symbols of royal overreach that ordinary people could point to, not an abstract philosophical complaint, but a very literal tax on survival itself. The gabelle was abolished in the early years of the Revolution, only to be reintroduced in a modified form under Napoleon not long after, a reminder that fiscal necessity has a way of outlasting even the revolutions fought partly against it. This is what makes the story of the gabelle so quietly haunting. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake in most cases, but ordinary fiscal pragmatism applied to a substance nobody could opt out of needing. And yet that very ordinariness, a tax on something as basic as flavor and preservation, became, over centuries, one of the sharpest symbols of the distance between a distant crown and the daily lives of the people it governed. Sometimes the smallest taxes carry the heaviest symbolic weight, precisely because they touch something nobody can simply choose to live without. Beneath the Polish town of Wieliczka lies one of the most extraordinary industrial sites in Europe. A salt mine worked continuously since the 13th century, its tunnels eventually stretching for hundreds of kilometers underground. Imagine generations of miners descending into that same mountain of salt, decade after decade, carving out not just galleries for extraction, but, in their rare quiet moments, entire chapels from the salt itself, altars, chandeliers, and statues, all sculpted from the very mineral they spent their working lives removing. It's a strange and moving detail. People who mined salt for a living chose, in their spare hours, to turn some of it into something sacred rather than something sold. Wieliczka's salt helped fund the medieval Polish crown so significantly that it was managed as a royal enterprise for centuries, its revenue considered so essential to state finances that it was written directly into royal budgets. At various points, income from this single mine is estimated to have provided a substantial share of the entire kingdom's revenue, an outsized contribution from one mountain of crystallized mineral beneath one modest town. Long before anyone spoke of natural resource economies in a modern sense, medieval Poland had already built one, quietly, around salt. Then England, the county of Cheshire, became closely tied to salt production, thanks to natural brine springs that had been exploited since at least Roman times. By the industrial era, towns like Northwich and Nantwich were dominated by salt works, their local economies almost entirely dependent on evaporating and refining brine drawn up from underground. So much salt was extracted from beneath Cheshire over the centuries that the ground itself began, in places, to subside, entire streets and buildings slowly sinking as the mined-out caverns below settled under their own weight, a strange and literal cost hidden beneath an otherwise ordinary industry. Imagine walking through a Cheshire salt town in the 19th century. Steam rising from open evaporating pans inside long, low buildings. Workers raking crystallizing salt into mounds with wooden tools blackened by years of heat and brine. The work was hot, repetitive, and physically demanding, carried out by generations of families who knew little else, their entire local identity woven around a substance most of their customers would never think twice about. Cheshire salt eventually traveled around the world, packed into ships bound for markets as far away as India and the Americas, carrying with it the quiet labor of a landlocked English county few of its buyers could have located on a map. In the Austrian Salzkammergut region, whose very name means salt chamber estate, salt mining shaped an entire regional identity that persists in tourism and local culture even today. The mines here, some of the oldest continuously worked deposits in the world, sit beneath a landscape now better known for its postcard lakes and mountains, the industrial past folded quietly beneath the scenic present. This is what makes it so quietly moving. Entire regions, across very different corners of Europe, built their whole sense of identity, prosperity, and even their eventual return to peaceful, ordinary life around the same underground mineral. Under British colonial rule in India, salt became one of the most tightly controlled commodities in the empire, its production restricted almost entirely to state-sanctioned sources. Indian law made it illegal for ordinary people to produce their own salt, even along coastlines where seawater and sunlight could have made it freely, forcing the population to buy salt from British-controlled sources at a price that included a substantial tax. For a population where salt was, as everywhere, a basic daily necessity, this was a tax that touched nearly every household, rich or poor, in a way few other levies could. In the spring of 1930, an aging lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi announced a plan that seemed, on paper, almost absurdly modest. He would walk to the sea and make salt, illegally, with his own hands. Imagine the scene as it unfolded. Gandhi and a small group of followers setting out on foot from Sabarmati, walking roughly 240 miles over 24 days, joined by growing crowds along the route until the march numbered in the thousands. On the morning of April 6th, Gandhi reached the coastal village of Dandi and bent down to lift a small lump of natural salt from the mud, breaking the law in the simplest, quietest way imaginable. The genius of the Salt March lay precisely in its smallness. Gandhi didn't call for an armed uprising or a formal declaration of independence. He called attention to a law so intrusive that it criminalized picking up salt from the ground, a law that touched the daily life of literally every Indian household, wealthy or poor, in a way that more abstract political grievances never could. The image of ordinary people making their own salt in open defiance of colonial law spread rapidly, inspiring similar acts of civil disobedience across the subcontinent and drawing international attention to India's independence movement in a way few previous protests had managed. Tens of thousands of people were eventually arrested in the wave of civil disobedience the Salt March inspired, including Gandhi himself, and the movement did not immediately overturn the salt tax or win independence outright. But its symbolic power proved lasting, becoming one of the defining images of India's long path toward independence in 1947. Remembered far beyond the specific policy it protested. It's a striking historical footnote. One of the 20th century's most consequential political movements found its most powerful early symbol not in weapons or speeches, but in a single handful of sea salt. This is what makes salt's political history so quietly haunting. The very ordinariness that made it easy to tax also made it, eventually, the perfect symbol for resisting that tax. A government can make almost anything illegal on paper, but there's something deeply revealing about a law so intrusive it has to forbid people from touching what washes up freely on their own shores. Salt, once again, proved itself capable of something far larger than seasoning a meal, this time quietly helping to end an empire. Across the Atlantic, salt shaped the early economic life of colonial and revolutionary America in ways that are easy to forget today. During the American Revolution, salt became a genuine strategic vulnerability. The Continental Army needed it to preserve meat for soldiers in the field, and British naval blockades made imported salt scarce and expensive almost overnight. Salt works along the American coast became targets of military raids precisely because denying an army its salt supply was, in a very real sense, denying it the ability to feed itself through a long campaign. Imagine a small saltworks on the Virginia coast in 1776. Its evaporating pans guarded not for any glamorous reason, but because a functioning army several days' march away depended on what those shallow pools of seawater were slowly becoming. Both sides understood the stakes. British forces specifically targeted colonial saltworks in several raids, recognizing that cutting off salt supply could quietly starve an army, even while its soldiers held their positions and won their battles. Salt scarcity during the Revolution pushed colonial governments to actively encourage domestic salt production, offering bounties and incentives to anyone willing to build new works along the coast. Further inland, the area around Syracuse, New York, sat atop such rich underground salt deposits that it became known simply as Salt City. Its economy built almost entirely around brine wells and evaporation works through the 18th and 19th centuries. At its peak, the region supplied a substantial share of all salt consumed in the young United States. Its production so central to the local economy that the Erie Canal, when built in the 1820s, was partly justified by the need to move Syracuse salt more efficiently to wider markets. A canal that would go on to transform American westward expansion owed part of its original economic case to barrels of a mineral most travelers along it barely noticed. The westward expansion of the United States carried its own salt frontier as new settlers pushed into regions without easy access to established supply lines. Salt licks and springs discovered along frontier trails became landmarks in their own right, sometimes fought over between settlers, and sometimes at the center of tension with Native American communities who had relied on the same mineral sources for generations before European settlement began. Wherever people moved into new territory, the search for reliable salt tended to follow close behind the search for water and fertile land, a quiet third pillar of frontier survival. This is what makes American salt history so easy to overlook and so revealing once you notice it. A resource so mundane it rarely appears in the grand narratives of revolution and expansion, and yet present, quietly, at nearly every turning point of them. Behind the muskets and the treaties and the canal locks sat modest wooden barrels of white crystal, moving quietly through the story the whole time. Sometimes the most important supporting characters in history never get their names in the textbook at all. The Industrial Revolution transformed salt from a food preservative into something far bigger, a raw material for an entirely new branch of chemistry. In the late 18th century, a French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc developed a process for converting common salt into soda ash, a chemical essential for making glass, soap, and textiles, at industrial scale for the first time. Imagine a smoky Leblanc factory sometime in the early 1800s. Vast quantities of salt being fed into chemical reactions that would have seemed like alchemy to anyone from the ancient world. Salt no longer just seasoning dinner, but quietly building the modern industrial economy from the inside out. The Leblanc process, for all its industrial importance, was notoriously dirty, releasing harsh byproducts that polluted the air and water around the factories that used it. It was eventually displaced by a cleaner method, the Solvay process, developed later in the 19th century, which used salt and limestone more efficiently to produce the same essential soda ash. This shift, one salt-based chemical process replacing another, quietly powered much of the glass, paper, and textile manufacturing that defined the industrial 19th century. An invisible mineral thread running beneath the visible machinery of factories and railways. By the 20th century, salt had become the starting point for an entire branch of industrial chemistry known as chlor-alkali production, splitting ordinary sodium chloride through electrolysis into chlorine and caustic soda. These two derivatives quietly underpin an enormous portion of modern manufacturing. Chlorine for water treatment and plastics like PVC, caustic soda for soap, paper, and countless industrial processes most people never think about. The salt shaker on a dinner table and the chlorine that keeps drinking water safe trace back to the very same mineral, split apart by electricity into two very different modern necessities. This is what makes salt's modern chemical life so quietly astonishing. Fewer than 3% of the salt produced worldwide today is actually used for food. The overwhelming majority disappears into industrial processes, de-icing roads, softening water, manufacturing plastics and chemicals, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The mineral that once defined the value of an entire meal has quietly become something closer to industrial plumbing, essential and everywhere, and almost entirely unnoticed. Modern road salt, spread across winter highways to melt ice, represents one of the largest single uses of salt in industrialized nations today. Imagine a fleet of trucks moving slowly along a highway before dawn, scattering crystals across the asphalt, an entirely unglamorous continuation of the same basic chemistry that ancient Romans understood, that salt lowers the freezing point of water. Millions of tons of it are spread across roads every winter across the world's colder regions, a scale of consumption that would have seemed unimaginable to to any of the ancient salt traders whose entire caravan might carry only a tiny fraction of a single modern truck's load. Today's largest salt-producing nations include China, the United States, India, and Germany, extracting salt through modern mining, solar evaporation, and brine processing at a scale ancient civilizations could never have conceived of. The Cura salt mine in Pakistan, one of the largest and oldest salt mines in the world, has been worked in some form for centuries and today extracts hundreds of thousands of tons annually. Its deep pink crystals sold around the world as Himalayan salt. It's a curious modern irony that a mineral so historically tied to scarcity and struggle is now, in some of its forms, marketed as a premium luxury good. Speaking of luxury, a small niche of the modern salt industry has moved in a direction almost opposite to industrial mass production. Fleur de sel, hand-harvested from the surface of salt pans in places like Brittany and Portugal using techniques barely changed from centuries past, sells for many times the price of ordinary table salt, prized by chefs for its delicate crunch and mineral complexity. Imagine a modern salt harvester working the same shallow pans their grandparents worked, using wooden rakes instead of industrial machinery, producing by hand in an afternoon what a factory could produce in seconds, and finding that the slowness itself is exactly what makes it valuable. This return to artisanal salt production reflects something quietly familiar in modern consumer behavior, a willingness to pay a premium not just for a product, but for the story and the patience behind how it was made. It's almost a mirror image of salt's ancient history, when scarcity itself created value. Today, in an age of practically limitless industrial salt, it's the deliberate absence of industrial efficiency that creates a different, smaller kind of value instead. This is what makes it so quietly fascinating. The same mineral has managed to occupy nearly every economic role imaginable, from desperate necessity to casual abundance to boutique luxury, sometimes within the very same century. Salt's long economic importance left fingerprints scattered across ordinary language in nearly every culture that valued it. The English phrase, "worth one's salt," traces directly back to the idea of a worker's wages being tied to salt, a lingering echo of the same root that gave us salary in the first place. To call someone the salt of the earth is to call them fundamentally valuable, essential, unpretentious, a compliment that only makes sense if you remember how central this ordinary mineral once was to daily survival. In several ancient Near Eastern cultures, sharing salt with someone carried the weight of a binding social contract, a covenant of trust and hospitality that obligated both parties to treat each other honorably. The phrase, "a covenant of salt," found in several ancient religious texts reflects this, an agreement considered permanent and incorruptible, much like salt itself, which resists decay in a way few other substances do. Imagine two rival families or tribes seated together, sharing a meal seasoned with salt, sealing an agreement not with a written document, but with the simple, shared act of eating together. Even the English word sauce descends from the same Latin root as salt, by way of salsa, literally salted. Somewhere behind every modern reference to a sauce, a salad, or a salary, an ancient Roman soldier's ration of preserving mineral is quietly still present, folded so deeply into everyday language that almost nobody notices it anymore. Language, in this sense, works like sediment at the bottom of a slow river. Old meanings settle, compress, and get built over, but they rarely disappear completely. In several European folk traditions, spilling salt was considered deeply unlucky, and the antidote, tossing a pinch of it over the left shoulder, persists today as an odd little superstition many people follow without ever asking why. Some historians trace this back to salt's sheer historical value. Wasting something once this expensive and this essential would naturally have felt like tempting fate, a superstition that has long outlived the economic reality that originally produced it. This is what makes it so quietly remarkable. An old anxiety about wasting a valuable resource has survived as a harmless little ritual, centuries after most people forgot exactly what they were once afraid of losing. Long before refrigeration, salt was the technology that made long-distance sea voyages possible at all, and nowhere is that more visible than in the story of salted cod. Basque fishermen were sailing far into the North Atlantic to fish for cod as early as the 15th century, some historians believe even before Columbus's famous voyage, preserving their enormous catches in salt for the long journey home. Imagine a Basque fishing vessel, hundreds of miles from shore, its crew gutting and salting cod on deck as fast as it could be hauled in, packing barrel after barrel below deck for a catch that needed to survive weeks at sea without spoiling. Salted cod, known in various languages as bacalhau, moru, or bacala, became a dietary staple across Catholic Europe, prized in part because it provided protein for the many days in the religious calendar when meat was forbidden but fish was permitted. This created a durable, reliable demand that made the salted cod trade extraordinarily lucrative for centuries, connecting fishing fleets in the cold North Atlantic to dinner tables as far away as the Mediterranean and eventually the Caribbean. A fish caught in icy northern waters, preserved in salt, might travel thousands of miles and change hands many times before it was finally cooked, its preservation alone making that entire journey economically possible. The demand for salted cod grew so significant that some historians argue it quietly shaped the pattern of early European exploration and settlement in North America, with fishing fleets establishing seasonal camps along the coast of Newfoundland and beyond, well before permanent colonization began in earnest. Salt cod stations along these coastlines needed reliable local salt supplies or steady shipments from Europe, tying the fate of distant colonial outposts to the same mineral trade that had shaped economies for thousands of years before them. The age of exploration, so often told through the lens of gold and spices, owed a quieter debt to a far more modest preservative sitting in barrels below deck. Salted meat and fish also became a defining feature of provisioning for the transatlantic slave trade, a use of salt's preservative power tied to one of history's greatest moral catastrophes. The brutal economics of that trade depended, in part, on the same preservation technology that had once helped feed Roman legions and medieval sailors. A stark reminder that a neutral, useful technology can be put in service of profoundly different human purposes, from feeding a fishing village to sustaining an atrocity. It is not a detail to dwell on in graphic terms, but it is not one to leave out either. Salt's history, like the history of most essential resources, is entangled with both remarkable human ingenuity and real human suffering, and an honest telling holds space for both. This is what makes salt's role in early globalization so quietly significant. It wasn't gold or spice that first stitched distant coastlines together into a single trading world, so much as the humble, repeated need to keep food edible across long ocean crossings. Behind almost every early transoceanic voyage, in barrels stowed below deck, sat the same ordinary crystal that had shaped trade routes on land for thousands of years before a single ship ever left a European harbor. The sea, in the end, needed the same simple technology the desert caravans had always relied on. In parts of Ethiopia and the surrounding Horn of Africa, salt didn't just get traded for currency. For a long stretch of history, it effectively was the currency. Bars of salt called a mole, cut to a standardized size in the Danakil Depression, one of the hottest and most inhospitable places on Earth, circulated as a recognized medium of exchange well into the 20th century, alongside coins and other goods. Imagine a marketplace in highland Ethiopia where a trader might pay for grain, cloth, or livestock not with a coin stamped by any government, but with a slab of hardened salt, its value understood and accepted across a huge stretch of territory. The Danakil Depression, where much of this salt originated, remains one of the most extreme environments on the planet, its temperatures regularly among the hottest recorded anywhere on Earth. Salt caravans, led by the Afar people, still cross this landscape today. Camels, loaded with slabs cut by hand from the dried lakebed, following routes that have likely been walked in some form for well over 1,000 years. It's a rare, living continuity, a trade almost unchanged since long before any of the empires we've discussed tonight had even risen, let alone fallen. Salt currencies weren't unique to Ethiopia. In parts of the Sahara, salt slabs functioned as a recognized store of value for centuries, and various African, Asian, and even some early European economies used salt, in one standardized form or another, as something closer to money than to mere merchandise. What made salt so suited to this role was precisely what made it valuable in the first place. It didn't spoil. It was divisible into predictable units. It was universally needed, and unlike livestock or grain, it didn't degrade while sitting in storage waiting to be spent. This is what makes salt's occasional role as literal currency so quietly illuminating for understanding money itself. Economists often describe money as needing a few basic properties: durability, divisibility, portability, and broad acceptance as valuable, and salt, almost by accident of its chemistry and universal necessity, checked nearly every one of those boxes long before anyone had formally described what money needed to be. In some quiet corner of nearly every early civilization, before coins, before paper, before any of it, people had already discovered that a mineral resistant to decay made for a remarkably convincing substitute for gold. Russia experienced one of history's more dramatic salt-related uprisings in 1648, when a sharply increased salt tax, imposed by the government of young Tsar Alexis, helped ignite what became known as the Moscow Salt Riot. The new tax replaced several older, smaller levies with a single, heavier tax on salt, hitting ordinary people hard since salt was essential not just for flavor, but for preserving the fish and meat that made up much of the common diet. Imagine crowds gathering in the streets of Moscow, anger over the tax fusing with older grievances against corrupt officials, until the unrest boiled over into days of rioting, looting, and the killing of several despised government figures. The Moscow Salt Riot forced the government into a partial retreat, and the salt tax itself was eventually repealed, though broader tensions between the Russian crown and its subjects continued to simmer for years afterward. It stands as one of the clearest examples in history of how a tax on something this ordinary, not land, not luxury, but a jar of preserving crystal in every kitchen, could ignite unrest capable of shaking a government at its very center. Salt taxes, again and again across very different empires, seem to test the same basic threshold. How much can a government ask of its people before an essential daily need becomes an unbearable daily insult? England, too, experimented with salt taxation at various points in its history, applying excise duties on salt production that fluctuated in severity across different centuries and different governments. These duties were sometimes resented enough to encourage smuggling along England's own coastlines, echoing the same patterns already visible in France and China, a state drawing a legal boundary around an essential resource, and an informal economy quietly growing up around that boundary's edges. By the 19th century, most European nations had gradually eased or eliminated their salt taxes, partly recognizing how disproportionately these levies burdened poorer households, who spent a much larger share of their limited income on basic necessities like salt. This is what makes the long history of salt taxation so quietly consistent across wildly different cultures. Whether in Han Dynasty China, Bourbon France, Tsarist Russia, or colonial India, governments kept reaching for the same lever, and populations kept responding with the same mixture of resentment, smuggling, and occasional open revolt. Few resources reveal quite so clearly the tension at the very heart of taxation itself. The need of a government to fund itself, weighed against the need of ordinary people to simply live. Salt, unassuming as it looks on a table, has quietly tested that balance more often, and in more places, than almost any other substance in human history. By the late 19th century, American salt production had consolidated into large industrial operations, and in 1911, the Morton Salt Company introduced a small blue package that would become one of the most recognizable brands in American grocery history. Its label carried a simple slogan, "When it rains, it pours," referring to a new additive that kept the salt from clumping in humid weather, a modest technical innovation that transformed a commodity people had bought loose from barrels for centuries into a branded, standardized consumer product. Imagine how strange this shift must have felt to anyone with memories of older salt trade. The same mineral once smuggled across French provincial borders and carried by camel across the Sahara, now sitting quietly on a shelf in a recognizable cardboard cylinder. The Morton Salt Company later became the subject of a notable American antitrust case, decided by the Supreme Court in 1948, concerning pricing practices that gave large retail buyers quantity discounts unavailable to smaller competitors. The case became a foundational reference point in American price discrimination law, studied by generations of law students ever since. A strange modern echo of ancient salt monopolies, this time argued not with soldiers or smugglers but with lawyers and legal briefs. Salt's economic significance had traveled a long road, from Roman soldiers' rations to a footnote in the history of American antitrust law. Economists today often reach for salt as a textbook example of what's called inelastic demand, a good whose consumption barely changes even when its price rises or falls significantly. Unlike a luxury item, which people might simply stop buying if it becomes expensive, salt's role in food preservation and basic diet historically meant that people kept buying roughly the same amount whether the price doubled or was cut in half. This exact property is precisely what made salt such an appealing target for taxation throughout history. A government could tax it heavily and remain confident that demand, and therefore revenue, would hold steady. It's a quiet thread connecting a modern economics classroom directly back to the reasoning of Han Dynasty tax officials, 2,000 years and half a world apart. The same inelastic quality that made salt so reliably taxable across history also makes it a useful lens for understanding modern debates about taxing other necessities, from staple foods to essential medicines. Whenever a government today weighs a tax on something people cannot easily do without, it is, in effect, retracing a very old argument that salt forced onto the historical record again and again, dynasty after dynasty, kingdom after kingdom. This is what makes it so quietly remarkable. A substance this small has managed to sit at the center of economic reasoning across nearly every era of recorded history, right up through the present day. High on the Tibetan Plateau, one of history's most physically demanding salt trades unfolded for centuries, carried out largely by yak caravans crossing some of the highest inhabited terrain on Earth. Salt harvested from remote high-altitude lakes was loaded onto yaks and driven for weeks across mountain passes toward lower Himalayan valleys, traded there for barley and further south for tea, wool, and other goods unavailable at such extreme elevation. Imagine a caravan of yaks picking their way along a narrow mountain trail, drivers wrapped against thin, freezing air, salt slabs lashed to each animal's back, following a route that had likely changed very little in 1,000 years. This Tibetan salt trade connected communities separated by some of the most forbidding terrain on the planet, exchanging a resource abundant on the high plateau for goods abundant only at lower elevations. Salt traders sometimes traveled for months at a time, camping in tents through brutal cold, navigating passes that could close without warning under sudden snowfall. The physical toll of this trade was immense, and yet it persisted for centuries precisely because both sides of the exchange needed something the other side had in abundance. The same basic economic logic that drove Saharan caravans, expressed instead in yak hair and frozen mountain air. Salt held deep ritual significance in Japan as well, where it has long been used in Shinto purification rites, scattered at the entrances of buildings, sumo wrestling rings, and funeral gatherings to cleanse spaces of impurity. Imagine a sumo wrestler tossing a handful of salt across the ring before a match, a gesture repeated for centuries, connecting a modern televised sporting event to ancient beliefs about salt's power to purify and protect. Salt farmers along Japan's coastline, in some regions, still use traditional evaporation methods passed down through generations, producing salt valued as much for its connection to tradition as for its taste. In ancient Egypt, natron, a naturally occurring mixture of salts harvested from dry lake beds in the Nile Valley, powered an entire industry built around death itself. Priests and embalmers used natron to dry and preserve bodies during mummification, a process that could take many weeks and required substantial quantities of the mineral for a single burial. The natron trade became economically significant enough that specific lake beds were closely controlled, their harvest tied directly to Egypt's elaborate funerary economy, an entire belief system about the afterlife resting, in a very literal sense, on access to the right kind of salt. This is what makes salt's spiritual and ritual role so quietly consistent across cultures that never had any contact with one another. Shinto purification in Japan, sacred covenants in the ancient Near East, funerary preservation in Egypt, ceremonial exchange across the Sahara. Something about salt's resistance to decay, its clean crystalline permanence, seems to have nudged human imagination in the same direction again and again, toward purity, permanence, and the boundary between life and what comes after it. a substance this ordinary managed, across dozens of unconnected civilizations, to become a quiet stand-in for something eternal. The medieval empire of Ghana, and later the even larger Mali Empire, built substantial portions of their wealth on controlling the middle point of the trans-Saharan salt and gold trade routes we touched on earlier tonight. Rulers taxed caravans passing through their territory in both directions, extracting a share of the gold moving north and the salt moving south, positioning their kingdoms as indispensable middlemen in a trade neither side could easily route around them. The legendary wealth of Mali's ruler Mansa Musa, famous for a pilgrimage to Mecca, so lavish it reportedly disrupted gold prices across the regions he passed through, rested in part on exactly this kind of positional control over a trade built around salt. Imagine the court of a medieval West African empire, scribes carefully recording the caravans passing through, tallying the salt slabs and gold dust changing hands, calculating the ruler's share with the same careful precision any tax collector anywhere in the world would recognize instantly. These were not marginal, minor kingdoms. They were among the wealthiest and most sophisticated states of their era, their prosperity resting on geography as much as on governance, sitting exactly where two essential goods needed to cross paths. Across the Atlantic, salt shaped trade networks among indigenous peoples of North America long before European contact, with salt springs and licks serving as important trading and gathering sites for many nations. Salt was traded, sometimes over considerable distances, for goods like furs, tools, and foodstuffs, following trails that in some cases European settlers would later widen into their own roads and eventually highways. Imagine a trading gathering at a well-known salt spring, different nations arriving from different directions, exchanging goods at a site whose value had been recognized and respected for generations before any European ship had reached the coast. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec and earlier Maya civilizations developed extensive salt production along coastal lagoons and inland salt flats, with salt serving both as a staple good and, at times, as a form of tribute owed to ruling elites. Aztec markets, famously vast and well organized according to early Spanish accounts, included dedicated salt vendors among their many specialized traders, salt sitting alongside cacao beans and textiles as one of the recognized units of everyday commercial life. This is what makes it so quietly remarkable. On every inhabited continent, independently, human societies arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about how to organize an economy, and salt, again and again, ended up sitting near its very center. The Ottoman Empire, spanning centuries and 3 continents, maintained careful control over salt production and taxation across its vast territories, treating salt revenue as one of many pillars supporting an enormous and complex imperial bureaucracy. Salt pans along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts, some worked since ancient Greek and Roman times, continued operating under Ottoman administration, their output carefully recorded and taxed by officials whose job, in some ways, differed little from their Roman or Byzantine predecessors centuries earlier. Empires rise, empires fall. Languages and religions and ruling families change entirely. And yet, quietly, someone is still standing beside the same salt pan, keeping the same kind of ledger. Byzantine administrators, inheriting much of Rome's fiscal apparatus, also maintained salt monopolies and taxation in various provinces, treating this ancient revenue source with the same seriousness their Roman predecessors had applied centuries before. Imagine a Byzantine tax official in Constantinople, poring over records not unlike those a Roman clerk might have kept 1,000 years earlier. The specific empire changed entirely, while the underlying logic of taxing an unavoidable necessity remained stubbornly, almost comically, the same. In medieval Italy, some of the earliest sophisticated banking and credit instruments in European history developed in city-states whose wealth was partly tied to controlling regional salt production and trade. Wealthy merchant families sometimes extended loans secured, directly or indirectly, against future salt revenues. An early and unglamorous ancestor of the kind of asset-backed lending that would, centuries later, become an entire branch of modern finance. It's easy to imagine banking as something that emerged from grand trading ventures and glittering commodities like silk and spice. But often, quietly underneath those more romantic stories, sat something as ordinary as guaranteed future income from a salt pan. Even the geography of the modern world still carries salt's fingerprints in places most people never connect back to economics at all. The Great Salt Lake in the American West and the vast, blinding white expanse of Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, the largest salt flat on Earth, both sit atop mineral wealth that continues to matter economically today. The Uyuni Flat in particular holding some of the world's largest known lithium reserves beneath its crust of salt. In a strange, quiet continuity, the same salt flats once crossed by indigenous traders on foot are now central to the economics of electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy storage. An ancient mineral landscape finding an entirely new reason to matter in a world its original traders could never have imagined. Ancient Mesopotamia offers one of history's earliest cautionary tales about salt, though this time the salt was not a resource to be harvested, but a slow, invisible threat to an entire agricultural economy. Centuries of irrigation in the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates gradually drew salts up from deep in the soil to the surface, a process called salinization, slowly poisoning fields that had once fed some of the earliest cities on Earth. Sumerian records from thousands of years ago describe declining wheat yields and a gradual shift toward more salt-tolerant barley, an ancient economy quietly adapting, generation by generation, to a crisis its own irrigation success had unintentionally created. Imagine Sumerian farmers, centuries apart, each generation noticing their fields yielding a little less than their parents had, without fully understanding why, only that the ground itself seemed to be turning pale and hard in places, crusted with a fine white residue. Some historians argue this slow agricultural decline contributed to the gradual weakening of Sumerian city-states, a reminder that salt's economic story isn't only about profit and trade. Sometimes it's about a resource in the wrong place becoming a slow, patient liability instead of an asset. Salt played a very different but equally consequential economic role high in the Andes, at the silver mines of Potosí in what is now Bolivia, one of the richest sources of silver the world has ever known. The patio process, developed to extract silver from ore using mercury, salt, and copper sulfate spread across open courtyards, depended on regular, substantial supplies of salt to help the chemical reaction along. Imagine the mountain town of Potosí at its colonial peak, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, its silver wealth flowing towards Spain, and quietly, beneath the surface of that transaction, barrels of ordinary salt feeding the very process that made the silver extractable in the first place. Salt has also long been essential to one of the world's more delicious economies, cheese making. The distinctive character of cheeses like Roquefort in France or Parmigiano Reggiano in Italy depends heavily on salt, both for flavor and for the careful control of moisture and bacteria during aging. Entire regional economies grew up around these salt-dependent cheeses, their reputations and price built, in part, on techniques of salting and aging refined over centuries, turning a simple preservative into one of the defining marks of a regional culinary identity recognized around the world. Vietnam's Mekong Delta and Thailand's coastal plains developed their own long traditions of solar salt evaporation, feeding regional diets, and, in the modern era, substantial export industries. Imagine vast, shallow salt fields stretching toward the horizon under a tropical sun, workers in wide-brimmed hats raking crystallized salt into small white pyramids, a scene that has likely repeated itself with only minor variation for many centuries. Southeast Asia's salt economies, much like those in Portugal or the Caribbean, prove again how consistently different cultures, given similar coastlines and similar sunlight, arrive independently at nearly identical solutions to the same ancient problem. The founding of Venice itself, according to some historians, was shaped in part by the salt marshes of its lagoon, which offered early settlers both a defensible refuge from mainland invaders and the raw material for an industry that would eventually help fund one of history's great maritime republics. Imagine the earliest Venetian settlers, driven onto these marshy islands by turmoil on the mainland, discovering almost by necessity that the shallow, salty water surrounding them could be turned into a livelihood rather than merely a refuge. What began as a defensive retreat slowly transformed, over centuries, into the economic foundation of a city that would eventually rival any power in the Mediterranean. Genoa, Venice's great maritime rival, fought bitterly over salt-producing territories and shipping routes across the medieval Mediterranean, salt wars flaring alongside the more famous conflicts over spice and silk that history books tend to emphasize more heavily. These two rival republics understood something essential long before modern economists gave it a name: that controlling a choke point in the trade of an unavoidable necessity was worth fighting for, sometimes even more fiercely than fighting over luxuries that wealthy customers could, in a pinch, simply learn to live without. In Korea, a traditional preparation called jukyeom, or bamboo salt, involves packing sea salt into bamboo stalks and roasting them repeatedly at high temperatures, a labor-intensive process rooted in traditional medicine practices going back centuries. Imagine artisans tending roaring kilns, bamboo stalks blackening and splitting under the heat as their contents are transformed, again and again, into a specialty product valued well beyond ordinary table salt. Even within a single mineral, human ingenuity found room for enormous variation. Endless small, regional inventions, each one turning the same basic crystal into something locally distinctive. The English town of Droitwich, whose very name carries an old root meaning roughly dirty settlement, a reference to the brine that once seeped everywhere through its streets, was already a significant salt-producing center in Roman Britain, its brine springs so reliable that production there continued in some form for close to 2,000 years. Imagine Roman administrators recording Droitwich's salt output in ledgers that, centuries later, medieval clerks would still be updating for exactly the same underground springs, the empires and languages around them changing completely, while the brine kept quietly rising from the same ground. Salt production in colonial Australia developed relatively late compared to the ancient salt economies of Europe, Asia, and Africa, but modern Australia has since become one of the world's largest solar salt exporters. Its vast, sun-drenched coastal evaporation ponds supplying much of Asia's industrial salt demand today. Imagine satellite images of these enormous salt ponds along the Western Australian coast. Vivid pink and white geometric shapes visible even from space. An ancient technology of sun and shallow water scaled up to a size no Bronze Age salt worker could possibly have imagined. This is what makes salt's global geography so quietly remarkable. Nearly every coastline, every desert basin, every mountain range with the right underground deposit has at some point in history hosted its own small chapter of the same universal story. Different tools, different climates, different centuries, entirely different cultures, and yet, again and again, the same basic human pattern: find the salt, extract it carefully, and carry it to wherever it is needed most. Few resources on Earth have inspired quite so much independent human ingenuity, scattered so widely, arriving at solutions so quietly similar. In the early 20th century, public health officials in several countries began a large-scale effort to add small amounts of iodine to table salt, addressing widespread iodine deficiency that had caused goiter and other health problems in communities far from the sea, where natural dietary iodine was scarce. Switzerland and the United States were among the first nations to adopt iodized salt programs in the 1920s, using the fact that nearly every household already purchased salt as a remarkably efficient distribution channel for a public health intervention. Imagine a public health planner realizing that the very universality which had made salt so easy to tax for thousands of years could, with the right addition, just as easily make it a vehicle for something protective instead. This use of salt as a delivery system for a broader public good repeated itself decades later in numerous countries working to reduce iodine deficiency disorders on a national scale. It's a quiet, almost poetic reversal of history, a resource once wielded by governments primarily as a source of revenue and control, eventually put to use, in a different century, as a source of basic public well-being instead. The mineral hasn't changed at all across these centuries. Only the intentions of the governments reaching for it have shifted, again and again, with the times. During Napoleon's disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia, salt scarcity became one of many compounding disasters facing the retreating French army. Without adequate salt, soldiers struggled to preserve what little meat they could find as the retreat dragged on through the brutal Russian winter, compounding starvation and disease that already devastated the army during its long, freezing withdrawal. Historians studying the campaign's logistics have pointed to salt shortages as one small but real thread among the many failures of supply that turned Napoleon's retreat into one of history's most catastrophic military collapses, a reminder that even the largest armies in history could be undone, in part, by something as basic as a missing seasoning. Salt shortages resurfaced as a genuine wartime concern again during both world wars, as naval blockades and disrupted trade routes strained supply chains that many nations had come to take for granted. Governments on multiple sides encouraged rationing and substitution, and in some occupied territories, salt smuggling networks re-emerged, echoing the same patterns seen centuries earlier under the French Gabelle. Wherever authorities restrict access to something essential, an unofficial channel tends to open beside it almost immediately. It's remarkable how consistently this same basic economic pattern reappears, century after century, technology after technology, regardless of how modern or advanced the surrounding world has otherwise become. Along the Atlantic coast of Portugal, the salt pans of Aveiro and the Algarve had already supported a substantial export trade for centuries before Portuguese sailors set out on the voyages that would define the country's age of discovery. Some historians note that the wealth, shipbuilding expertise, and maritime infrastructure built up around Portugal's older salt trade quietly helped lay the groundwork for the country's later, far more famous era of oceanic exploration. Imagine generations of Portuguese sailors first learning to navigate coastal waters simply to move barrels of salt between local ports, long before any of them ever dreamed of rounding the southern tip of Africa. Scandinavian trade during the Viking Age also depended heavily on salt for preserving the herring and cod that fed both local populations and lucrative export markets across northern Europe. Viking longships, more famous in popular memory for raiding, were just as often engaged in ordinary trade, carrying salted fish, furs, and other goods along well-established northern sea routes. Even the fiercest raiders of early medieval Europe needed reliable food for a voyage, and reliable food in that era almost always meant salted food. Salt marshes along the coasts of England and France gave rise to their own small, distinctive economy. The grazing of sheep on salt-tolerant coastal grasses, producing what's still known today as pré salé or salt marsh lamb, prized for a subtly different flavor imparted by the salty vegetation the animals graze on. Imagine flocks moving slowly across a wide tidal marsh at low tide, grazing on tough, salt-hardy grasses that would kill most other pasture plants, their meat later fetching a premium at market precisely because of where and on what they had fed. The labor history of salt mining includes its own difficult chapters, with miners in salt operations from Poland to England to the American Midwest organizing over the 19th and 20th centuries for safer conditions, fairer wages, and shorter hours in an industry whose underground work was, by nature, dangerous and physically punishing. These labor movements, echoing struggles happening simultaneously in coal mines and textile mills across the industrializing world, gradually won improvements, ventilation standards, safety regulations, and formal recognition of unions in many salt-producing regions. It's a quieter labor history than coal's, rarely remembered in the same breath, and yet built by people doing work just as demanding, deep beneath the same kind of ground. In the modern era, one of salt's more unexpected environmental economic stories involves desalination, the process of removing salt from seawater to produce fresh drinking water, now essential to water-scarce regions from the Arabian Gulf to Southern California. The leftover brine, concentrated and salty, has to be carefully managed and disposed of, an environmental and economic challenge quietly running in the opposite direction of everything we've discussed tonight. For thousands of years, humans worked hard to extract salt. Now, in places starved for fresh water, enormous effort and expense go into removing it instead. It's a strange full circle. The mineral once worth its weight in gold is now, in some contexts, treated as an expensive problem to be filtered carefully away. China's Grand Canal, one of the largest engineering projects in pre-modern history, was used for centuries to move goods across the empire, and salt was consistently among its most important cargoes, moving from coastal production centers toward inland cities that had no local supply of their own. Imagine long lines of barges moving slowly along the canal, some laden with grain, others with the licensed salt certificates that made their cargo legal under the state monopoly, watched over by officials whose entire careers revolved around ensuring this one commodity moved smoothly and, above all, was properly taxed along the way. An engineering marvel built for many purposes still found room, again and again, for the quiet logistics of salt. The Belgian chemist Ernest Solvay, whose salt-based soda ash process eventually displaced the older Leblanc method across the industrializing world, built one of the great industrial fortunes of the 19th century almost entirely on a more efficient way of processing the same ancient mineral. Solvay used part of that fortune to fund scientific research, including the famous Solvay conferences that brought together some of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, Einstein among them, to debate the emerging science of quantum mechanics. It's a strange and quietly wonderful historical detail. Some of the deepest conversations in the history of physics were funded, indirectly, by a smarter way of turning salt into industrial chemicals. Today, global salt production runs into the hundreds of millions of tons annually, with China, the United States, and India consistently ranking among the largest producers, their combined output dwarfing anything the ancient world could have imagined possible. And yet, even at this almost unimaginable scale, the fundamental economic principles remain the same ones we've traced across every era tonight: uneven natural distribution, essential and inelastic demand, and a long, quiet history of governments and traders alike recognizing its value long before anyone wrote the first textbook on economics. The scale has changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying logic, remarkably, has not changed at all. On the vast white surface of Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, small cooperatives of local salt harvesters still gather salt by hand today, much as their ancestors did, shaping it into small pyramids to dry under the intense high-altitude sun before packaging it for regional markets. Beneath their feet, however, lies one of the largest untapped lithium reserves on the planet, and in recent years, foreign governments and mining companies have shown growing interest in extracting it for use in electric vehicle batteries. Imagine a salt harvester working the same flat, blinding landscape their grandparents worked, aware that far below the crust they gather from by hand, a very different, very modern kind of mineral wealth is quietly waiting, and that its future extraction could reshape the local economy in ways no one fully knows yet. This tension between old, small-scale salt harvesting and new, large-scale mineral extraction echoes a pattern we've now seen repeat across nearly every era of tonight's story. A valuable resource drawing outside attention toward a place whose local population had quietly lived alongside it for generations. Whether it was Saharan gold traders eyeing desert salt, French tax collectors eyeing peasant households, or today's global battery industry eyeing an Andean salt flat, the underlying dynamic feels strangely familiar each time it resurfaces. Value, once discovered, rarely stays a secret for long. In the American West, the Great Salt Lake gave its name to the city that grew up nearby it. Founded by Mormon pioneers in 1847, seeking a remote place to settle and build a community, away from the persecution they had faced further east. Though the lake itself was too salty to farm around directly, early settlers did harvest some of its salt commercially, and the lake's name became permanently woven into the identity of the growing city beside it. Imagine those first pioneers arriving at a vast, silent, mineral-white expanse of water, naming their new home after the one striking feature the landscape offered them, a small linguistic echo of how many cities throughout history, Salzburg, Hallstatt, Lüneburg, ended up named, one way or another, after the salt nearby. In today's global economy, salt is traded as an ordinary industrial commodity, its price tracked by trade publications, and its supply chains studied by logistics firms, much like any other bulk material, iron ore, coal, or grain. It no longer commands the dramatic value it once did relative to gold or silver, and no modern government seriously considers building its fiscal foundation around it the way Han Dynasty China or Bourbon France once did. And yet, quietly, it still moves by the millions of tons every year, along shipping lanes and rail lines that are, in their own modern way, simply the newest version of the Via Salaria, the Saharan caravan routes, and the Tibetan yak trails that came long before them. Salt appears often enough in ancient literature and scripture that its symbolic weight clearly extended well beyond the kitchen or the marketplace. The biblical story of Lot's wife, transformed into a pillar of salt after looking back at the destruction of Sodom, uses salt as a symbol of permanence and consequence, a punishment that freezes a single choice into something unchanging forever. The ancient Greek poet Homer references salt as a divine substance in his own writing, and various ancient philosophers, including Plato, described it as something dear to the gods, worthy of respect beyond its ordinary usefulness. Long before any of tonight's tax officials or trade caravans, salt had already earned a quiet place in how ancient people understood permanence, judgment, and the sacred. Across nearly every culture we've visited tonight, one detail keeps resurfacing in slightly different form. Salt earns its symbolic power not despite its ordinariness, but because of it. Gold is rare and beautiful, admired from a careful distance. Salt is common and unremarkable, present at every single meal, in every single household, rich or poor. Its value never depended on scarcity of encounter, the way gold's did. It depended on a need so constant and so universal that no civilization, anywhere, in any era, could simply choose to ignore it. This is, in the end, what makes salt's economic story so quietly different from nearly every other resource we might have chosen for a night like this one. Gold has driven conquest. Oil has driven modern geopolitics. Spices once justified entire ages of exploration. But salt's power was never loud or dramatic. It worked patiently, in the background, present in every kitchen, every ledger, every tax code, every trade route, quietly shaping the movement of people, empires, and money for longer than almost anything else humans have ever valued. In Iran, the Cherabad salt mine has yielded its own version of the preserved miners once found in Hallstatt, a set of remains now known as the Saltmen, some dating back more than 2,000 years, their skin, hair, and clothing remarkably preserved by the same dehydrating chemistry that worked its quiet magic on alpine miners half a world away. Imagine archaeologists lifting one of these figures from the mine centuries later, a leather boot still intact, a woolen garment still recognizable, the ordinary work clothes of a miner who never could have imagined becoming, one day, one of history's most vivid direct windows into ancient daily life. Separated by thousands of miles and different centuries, Iran and Austria's salt mines each preserved, by pure chemical accident, an intimate record of the very people who once did this dangerous, essential work. India's Sambhar Salt Lake in the northern state of Rajasthan has been a major salt-producing site for well over 1,000 years. Its shallow, mineral-rich waters drawing salt harvesters through Mughal rule, British colonial administration, and into independent India's modern economy. Mughal administrators taxed and regulated the lake's output much as rulers elsewhere in the world taxed their own salt sources, treating this single lake as a genuinely significant line item in a much larger imperial budget. The lake remains one of India's largest inland sources of salt today, its shallow pink-tinged waters a quiet, working continuation of an economic role it has held for well over a millennium. On the American frontier, cattle drovers moving herds along routes like the Chisholm Trail relied on natural salt licks scattered across the plains to keep their cattle healthy over weeks of long-distance travel, since livestock, like humans, require regular sodium intake to remain strong. Imagine a trail boss steering a herd of several thousand cattle slightly off course to reach a known salt lick. A small but essential detour built into the very geography of the cattle economy that would eventually feed much of a growing nation. Even in an economy built around beef rather than salt itself, the mineral quietly shaped the route, the timing, and the success of the entire enterprise. A handful of large companies now dominate much of the modern global salt trade. Names most people have never heard, even though their products likely sit in nearly every kitchen and on nearly every winter roadway they've ever driven. Firms like Cargill, KS, and Compass Minerals operate enormous mines and evaporation facilities across multiple continents, supplying food processors, chemical manufacturers, and municipal road departments with a steady, almost invisible stream of the same mineral that once justified armies, taxes, and revolutions. It's a strange kind of quiet victory for salt. After thousands of years of dramatic history, its modern chapter is mostly logistics spreadsheets and shipping manifests, ordinary and unremarkable, in exactly the way its ancient importance never was. The heavy modern use of road salt has brought its own quiet economic and environmental costs, as runoff carries dissolved salt into nearby streams, lakes, and groundwater, gradually altering freshwater ecosystems that evolved without ever needing to tolerate this much sodium chloride. Municipalities across colder regions now weigh the clear, immediate safety benefits of salted roads against these slower, harder-to-price environmental costs, researching alternatives like brine pretreatment and other de-icing compounds that might reduce the long-term ecological toll. It's a very modern version of a very old tension. How much of something so useful is too much? And who, in the end, quietly bears the cost of finding out? Standing back from all of it now, the Roman roads, the Saharan caravans, the Chinese monopolies, the Alpine mines, the Indian coastline where Gandhi once bent down to lift a handful of mud, a single, quiet pattern runs underneath every single story we've told tonight. Wherever human beings have gathered, organized themselves, and tried to build something lasting, salt has been there first, patiently waiting to be found, taxed, fought over, traded, and eventually taken almost entirely for granted. It never announced itself the way gold or oil or spice did. It simply sat there, small and white and unremarkable, quietly indispensable, letting louder resources take the credit, while it kept the whole system running underneath. Consider, for a moment, how differently salt behaves compared to almost every other resource that built an empire. Gold could be hoarded in a vault and admired without ever being used. Spices, once tasted, offered variety but not survival. Salt, by contrast, only ever mattered because it was consumed, used up, replaced, and needed again. A resource whose entire value came from being spent rather than saved, moving constantly rather than sitting still. Perhaps that's part of why it built roads and routes so persistently across every era we've walked through tonight. A resource defined by constant movement will always, eventually, carve movement into the world around it. It's worth sitting for just a moment with how many entirely unconnected human societies arrived at the same conclusions about this one ordinary mineral, without ever meeting, without ever trading a single idea between them. Bulgarian villagers building walls to protect a spring, Chinese officials designing one of history's oldest tax systems, West African rulers taxing caravans at a desert crossroads, Ethiopian traders cutting standardized bars to use as money. None of them read the other's history. None of them borrowed the idea. They simply looked at the same basic human need, sodium as essential to a working body as water itself, and built, independently, remarkably similar solutions around it. There is something quietly comforting in that pattern, if you let yourself sit with it for a while. Human beings, scattered across deserts and mountains and coastlines they could never have imagined belonged to the same species story, kept discovering the same truths about value, trust, scarcity, and need. Long before anyone wrote an economics textbook, ordinary people at salt springs and salt pans and salt mines had already worked out, through patient trial and lived necessity, most of what such a textbook would eventually try to explain. We've traveled a long way tonight, all of it following one small, ordinary crystal. We began at a muddy spring, where thirsty animals and early humans first crossed paths, and walked slowly forward through Bronze Age tunnels in the Alps, through Roman roads built specifically to carry salt toward a growing empire, through the silent, trusting trade of gold and salt across the widest desert on Earth. We sat for a while beside Chinese officials building one of history's oldest tax systems, and beside French villagers smuggling salt across quiet provincial borders in the dark. We watched an aging man in white cloth walk 240 miles to lift a handful of mud from the sea, and felt, quietly, how something this small could still help end an empire. We wandered through alpine mines and Andean silver works, past yak caravans on the Tibetan plateau and camel caravans in the Sahara, through cheese cellars in France and salted cod bound for Mediterranean tables, through a modern salt flat in Bolivia where old hands still shape salt into small white pyramids beneath a sky that has watched this same work for centuries. Through every version of this story, in every language, on every continent, the pattern held steady, a resource so ordinary it barely earns a second glance, and yet so essential that it quietly, patiently shaped almost everything built around it. If you're still awake, there's another slow, quiet story waiting for you on this channel whenever you're ready for it. Another thread to follow, another evening to drift through. And if tonight's story has done its job well, you're probably not awake for much longer at all. Before you go, if this kind of slow, wandering history helps you unwind, consider subscribing or leaving the channel a small comment about what part of tonight's story stayed with you longest. It helps more than you might think, and there's no rush about it at all. For now, let your jaw go soft. Let your shoulders sink fully into whatever is holding you. Let your breathing settle into something slow and unhurried, each breath a little quieter than the last, the way evening light settles gradually over still water. Let every thought from today dissolve gently, the way salt dissolves into water, disappearing without any struggle at all. Sleep well and good night.